Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Kagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Welcome everyone to Fortress on a Hill. We have a really great special episode for you guys today. Danny and I are going to talk about his new book, Patriotic Dissent. It's coming out on September the 8th. Is that right, Danny?
That's right. Yep, the 8th.
Coming out on the 8th. It's an amazing book. It's the history and the examination of patriotism that I've read about so far has been really empowering and eye-opening in a few different ways. But before we start talking about it real quick, I wanted to real quickly share with you guys our email and social media channel links. They're usually in the show notes, so if you ever want to find them, they're there, but I don't say it on the podcast very often, so I want to take 30 seconds and do that real quick. Our email is fortressonahill at gmail.com, and you can email any questions, any thoughts you have, ideas for episodes, anything like that. On Twitter, you can find us at Fortress on a Hill. Same deal with Twitter. And at Facebook at Fortress on a Hill. So real simple. It's all Fortress on a Hill. So Danny, let's start talking about this book. Like I said, I've really been enjoying reading it. You know, I always learn so much from your writing, period. But this fit into a different vantage for me. Something that I think we should talk about at some time, but we don't need to discuss today, is I've noticed more and more as we've done the podcast that you and I were in very different wars, if we'll say. You know, that the stories that you told me, the missions that you've been sent on, the amount of death that you saw both among your troops and among innocent civilians during your time has been really eye-opening for me. But I've started to look at your writing in that way and asking myself about the things that I didn't experience because, you know, so much of the military is tied up in combat support, which means that if you're not an infantryman, a Cav Scout, a tanker, there are things that you just don't see. You know, there are just events and missions and possibilities of war that you just don't consider. And so, moving forward, I hope that you and I get the chance to talk about that at some time. But I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute. Will you tell the folks what the book is about and how you got around to writing it?
Yeah, well, first thing I'm really glad you brought up is this idea of different wars. There's a couple of things that I think are important about that. So even within the same unit, as I've written about a bunch, even in the first book, people will experience the same events differently. So there's that, right? There's the psychological aspect of the confusion of war and various viewpoints. And then, you know, there's the different kinds of jobs, and most people don't realize, you know, the tooth to tail ratio. In other words, how many combat service support soldiers there are for every, you know, combat arms, right? So basically foot soldier, like how many, it's, you know, it's what is 7, 8, 9 to 1, and it changes over the years. So, you know, back in the day, like in the Civil War, it was like 1 to 1, and then in World War II, it's like 3 to 1, and then in Vietnam, and now it like really pushes up to like closer to 10 to 1. That does not mean those people aren't in combat. At one point, I mean, it did like in World War II more, but now with an insurgency and attacks on the roads and IEDs, you know, there was a point, I remember, that you may know some of this stat, Henry, where early in the insurgency, because I was still a cadet at West Point, and this stat was presented to me by a major in military science class, and it showed that the top 3 MOSs, military occupational specialties jobs, right, that were fatalities or wounded in action in the first 2 years of the Iraq War insurgency were, of course, infantry, but it was military police and 88 Mike truck drivers, right? And this military science infantry officer was like, well, why would that be, guys? And then, we did some discussion on tactics, and it was a pretty interesting day. But what his point was, well, look, if the classic tactic is IED, then who's on the road a lot? And of course it's truck drivers. And then people don't realize the extent to which I had a lot of respect for the military police in particular in Iraq, because they were just, and I know that everyone did different things within the military police community, but the ones that I dealt with a lot, they literally drove around all day visiting police stations, Iraqi police stations, and trying to mentor them and supply them and all this. And then, they were just getting hammered because they were always on the road, but even so, that's a different war than, the active raid or whatever, and then quite frankly, I wasn't some badass. I mean, the experience of the Navy SEAL raiding team is, different from mine. And so I think that's valuable and interesting to keep in mind. And I think that what we do need to avoid, and I try really hard to, probably not perfectly, but better than most, is this idea that okay, there's 2 wars, there's 3 wars, maybe there's more 10 wars, but some veterans fall into this dismissing others kind of thing, someone will hear, oh, well, he was just a loggy or something, and I don't mean MP, I mean legit, a supply sergeant or something. It's oh, that person's service doesn't matter. And, I just think that's really dangerous talk. And I think it's usually bred by insecurity and self-righteousness, which I've always called the cardinal or original sin of the soldier. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So that's a long intro that I just wanted to mention, but the book was weird. One thing that readers will notice is it's very short for me or for anyone, but especially for me. And that was by design. I had been in LA with Bob Scheer, senior editor over at Truthdig. Rest in peace. Pour some liquor out for our dead homies at Truthdig. And now of Scheer Post. And of course, he's kind of a legendary journalist, 84 years old, interviewed several presidents. So I was out there visiting him for some work at USC and some other crap. And yeah, me, him, and Steve Wasserman from Heyday Books were, I don't even know how it came up. We were discussing patriotism, or we were discussing the forever wars, or how to fight this, how we can make a difference. And it was kind of one of those dark conversations. And Henry, you know these very well, because that's how soldiers get by, is macabre humor and stuff. But, it was one of those really dark and serious conversations of futility, that feeling of the problem's just too big, we can't change minds. I fall for that a lot, especially with this stuff that's going on in the streets. I think to myself, oh my God, I can't persuade my father. How am I going to persuade anyone else? And, are people just too far apart? Are some people unreachable? These are dangerous concepts, although they're reasonable. I mean, there's a reason it feels that way, but we're having one of those conversations about ending the wars or reframing American foreign policy. And then, like I said on the Zoom talk the other night, either Bob or I or both said something to the effect of, if we don't conceptually change the entire notion of what it means to be an American and more specifically be an American patriot, if we don't have a philosophical and cultural change, then this is all for nil. And that drove one of us to throw sort of the buzzword patriotic dissent out there. The idea that if we don't challenge the very notion of patriotism, what value it has, if any, how it could be renegotiated, sort of reframed. And Steve Wasserman, who is an old friend of Bob, he's younger than Bob, he's the, kind of the head of Heyday Books out of Berkeley. He said to me, do you think you could write that up? And, the whole thing, this new, philosophical kind of take. And I said, yeah, of course I can do anything, and he's like, all right, well, I want a coffee table treatise on this, not some huge book, I want something that's different from what you would maybe normally do. And more like an extended essay, I guess, than your typical book. And so that's what he asked for. And I had to write it really quick, actually, relatively, for the publishing industry. And this is kind of how it came out. And it does read like an essay. So it's like three things that are going on, and then I'll kind of stop there. It's only like 160 pages, but it's part memoir again, right? Just like the last book was, but this one's a little broader, whereas the last book was more focused on my time in Iraq. A little bit memoir, a lot of it like philosophical take on what patriotism is, how it ought to be reframed, and why dissent can be the most patriotic of things. And then, of course, because it's me and it's important, it's history. So a history of dissenters, particularly military dissenters, throughout our history. I mean, I think I talk basically like War of 1812 or Civil War or Mexican-American War all the way up to Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, showing that there is a long history to this. So in other words, what I'm describing, what I'm calling for in terms of a reformulation of the dissent as a form of patriotism is actually has a long backstory. And that's kind of what I was getting at. And so here it is, and I'm cautiously optimistic that this one is going to, make some waves and get in some people's hands. So far, so good.
You mentioned Ghost Riders of Baghdad a little bit. I'm curious about not so much direct comparisons between the two books, but how would you say your personal opinions on patriotism and dissent changed between the time you wrote Ghost Riders and now Patriotic Dissent?
Yeah, that's a great question. No one's really asked me that yet. I've undergone, like most of us in this, movement, so to speak, I've undergone like an intellectual and sort of ethical journey, an evolution, really. And so when I wrote Ghost Riders, which was in 2014, the end of my second year of grad school, I had only recently been back from Afghanistan. I knew a lot of stuff, but I wasn't like fully developed in my critique, like my systemic critique of the American militarist state. I mean, no doubt, like an average person would read that and be like, "Oh, this is like a radical, like kind of leftist dude," but those people who are like a little bit more in the know and kind of follow this stuff will recognize that at the time of Ghost Riders, I was like skeptical of like patriotism and like masculinity and stuff, but I wasn't talking about that a whole lot. I mean, I just didn't have the language or the expertise. I hadn't really thought through it quite enough yet. I was floundering a little, like just finding my voice, and I'd never written anything publicly. So this book definitely is a little bit more developed conceptually. So even though it's a shorter book, it's probably a little more clear in its like hypothesis, and I've thought through this more systemic critique of empire and the culture that's behind it, which is really what this book is about, right? It's about the problematic culture of patriotism, and it really does seek to answer the question: is patriotism toxic? As Bob Scheer says all the time. He always asks me that question, and so I think it's an important question. Like, is patriotism toxic? And I think that what I kind of come up with is like, yes, usually is basically my answer, which is a bit of a hedge, but the idea being, it would be, it's almost always toxic. It's almost always rooted in a history of sort of imperialism and patriarchy. It's almost always been a tool of oppression, both at home and overseas. It's almost always been a way to dupe folks into doing awful things, oftentimes that aren't in their own interest or the nation's or certainly humanity's. However, right, I say there are variations on a spectrum of patriotism that are complicated, and that at the far end, there has always been this tradition of sort of patriotic dissent, this idea that at its best, patriotism is the sense that I want my country to be what it is capable of, right? Live up to its aspirations, despite the fact that so many of our founding documents, which I talk about, are flawed and stuff. It would not be fair not to admit that there has been beautiful stuff written by American theorists and politicians, that there have been, even some of whom were like super hypocritical and all that, but there is something in the political tradition that comes out of the United States, especially in the late Enlightenment around the Revolution, that is valuable, and that should we live up to it, it could be worthwhile. And so Real Patriotic Dissent then is not only a systemic critique of current policy, but it's a demand, a participatory, which, I talk about in the book, the different types, but a participatory demand that the nation live up to its principles. And that's why I call patriotic dissent a, participatory principled patriotism, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of what that was about. I could not have written that, right? I couldn't have thought through and articulated that at the time I was writing Ghost Riders of Baghdad. I was still in the army. I was really in some personal turmoil emotionally, and making my way in the world. I had no idea that I was going to be a writer. I just wanted to tell this story. A lot of it was just vomit. I was just vomiting out what had been in my head for years. This was more thought through and organized, I guess.
So there's a couple places in the book where you discuss some deeply personal anecdotes, to include being suicidal and dealing with the emotions / reality of the death and injuries of your own soldiers. I'm curious, not so much on an abstract level, but a more personal one. What discoveries did you make for yourself when you were writing this book? Because it's deeply personal.
This was also a bit of therapy, but I wrote it at a little bit of a better place in my life. I had come out of a couple of hard years, as you know, from the Insider Baseball, and I've had a really good 8 or 9 months or so, and kind of got my life together, whatever that means. I understand it's halting, it could fall back again, but this book I was really plugging out the last bit of it just as I was kind of coming into a healthier place in my life that I'm living in now. And so there's a lot of sharing, there's a lot of kind of confession and admission of past problems and tough times and phases that I've went through that, again, I'm not saying I'm out of, but it was more reflective. I could look at it a little bit more objectively and say this is what I was feeling, this is where I was at, with the hindsight of a little bit of health in my personal life. So unlike Ghost Riders, which was completely just written in the breach, of just turmoil and, again, still in the army and not sure what all this is about and where my life's going to go. This one was a little more reflective.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think might be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military, or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for females and minorities and inflicts on minorities around the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment, pause the episode, share this with them. Now, our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So, let's bring out these honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Lawrence Taylor, Tristan Oliver, Marwan, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can always contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt.com. Make sure you check for promo codes before you order. And now, let's get back to the podcast.
The experience of writing it is always tough. People used to ask me all the time, is it healthy for you? Like, is it a net positive for you to be a writer, given what you write about? Like, is it good for your mental health? I used to get that question a lot, like early on when I would do like podcasts and stuff. And I would always say like, yes and no, right? Yes, it gives me something to do. Yes, because I love it and I'm a dork and I want to read and write because it's like what I enjoy and it's also like what I can do, right? You know me and Mark's like to each according to his ability, like that's my ability, right? Yeah. So that was always yes, but then the negative was always, but I mean, I make a living reliving the worst things in some cases, when I write personal stuff and then reliving it because usually I don't tell my own personal stories per se, but when you write about Yemeni kids starving to death as a matter of course, just like what I do, yeah, I mean, that's a dark thing. So then I always felt like, am I like ever going to be able to get out of the morass? You know what I mean? Like, am I going to be stuck here mentally by virtue of the decisions I've made? Like, should I start writing, kindergarten kids books? I used to think, now, of course, side note, those would be some dark kindergarten books. This would not be the BFG. You know what I mean? It would be like, but anyway. But I used to say that, like, maybe a different job would be actually almost better. So I was always torn about it. Right now, and when I wrote the book, I think overall it was definitely more in the positive, like definitely more in the therapeutic and cathartic. It's kind of the culmination of a lot of ideas that I've been tossing around from, 2000, from when I left West Point. So like 2017 till now. So it's really a summary in a sense of like the philosophical conclusions I'd come to, during that really tough transition from, fairly well-regarded military officer to civilian to kind of writer activist. So yeah, I think overall the experience was pretty positive. And one of the things that was interesting is more than even my normal writing, which I do tend to write fairly quickly, but this just like really flowed off the fingertips and off the head. Like I didn't have to do a whole lot of research. I mean, there's a lot of research, heavy history and stuff, but I'd already done most of that work. So I was able to just go back. But what I mean is like the prose itself was like there. It's shit that I stayed up at night thinking about a year ago. And like, so it was like, in other words, all the data was there. And like Bob and Steve just kind of gave me the outlet and opportunity. And I'm really thankful to Heyday, who was super great, like to just let it go, to like, just let it out. And, so the stuff was there and it would have been kind of a waste if I didn't publish it, I think. And so that's what the experience was like. I hope that it was pretty positive, I would say. And I'm pretty happy with the output. I mean, no, I don't read the stuff that I write like ever again. Usually, like I never want to see it ever again. Like I hate it. Like I can't open Ghostwriters. I'm like, oh my God, did you really write like that? I'm like embarrassed of myself. Just even the technical writing, like I'm just like, oh my God, you were terrible. But this one, I mean, I didn't go back and like read the whole thing. But I've gone back and like looked at it to give like book talks and stuff. And more than usual, when I read it, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. Like I'm pretty happy with it, which is rare for me,
Well, I'm really enlivened to hear that, Danny, that it's been such a great and cathartic experience for you being able to get those ideas out there. I'm curious, did you notice any role of heroism or the more black and white ideas played during the time of going the book? How did you see the notion of a hero doing it, maybe compared a little bit to Ghost Riders? And was there points where that concept started to buckle under examination?
Yeah, like what it means to be a hero and otherwise. Yeah, totally. And I think in Ghost Riders, I was still, like, all of us are a product, I think, of nature, nurture, the kind of culture we were raised in, and that's family, that's neighborhood, that's profession, it's class, and it's also America, right? It's just and generation. So we're all a product of all those things, and I think that, like, the question for any human being is the extent to which finally, eventually, you can kind of transcend that, right? Like, transcend the bias, identify it, and then say, no, I'm going to, like, take an empirical look at whatever this is and then come to a new decision about what's right. You know, most people never even try. Fewer than that ever get to even noticing the bias, you know, and then fewer still do anything about it and stuff like that. And I am somewhere on that spectrum and I'm not there yet. But I will say that at the time of Ghost Riders, I was definitely still romantically attached to the classic hero within the military. I mean, people who are conservative or more pro-war or even just more pro, like, military and, like, the current classic construct would not think that. They'd be like, are you kidding? Like, you totally lambasted the military and, like, every concept of patriotism in Ghost Riders. But I know, and you know, and people who kind of read this stuff a lot know, like, no, I was still there. You know, I mean, I think there was still, like, a romance to this sort of, like, sacrifice in war. I talk a lot about military service, and, like, when I go back and look at any of the essays and stuff that I wrote in that time where I talk about the draft and who served and who didn't, I sense in my writing a degree of, like, self-righteousness and also a little bit of, like, judgmental criticism of those who don't serve. One could read, and I didn't mean to do that, but I know I was, probably subconsciously. But also, if you read some of the stuff, even from, like, an intellectual standpoint, it's clear that I'm saying, look, it's better that the guys at Harvard served, right? Rather than just, you know, what I should just be saying is, like, it is better that there was more, you know, divided service, a little bit more fairly spread, and that there was the sense that everyone is equal and everyone has, like, an equal obligation and responsibility. But if you really read it, Ghost Rider, some of that stuff, it's clear that I've still got the sort of mythological military hero a little bit high up in my pantheon, despite the critique. That's never probably going to completely go away. I mean, I was raised in the martyrdom culture of, you know, Irish Catholic death cult. There's probably always going to be that aspect of, like, sort of the military sacrifice and heroics that are associated with it. What's different, I think, is that in the time between Ghost Riders and this book, and in terms of publication, we're talking about almost 5 full years. My heroes have legitimately changed, and, like, they are folks who had the courage to fight conventions and fight militarism, even at the expense of being called weak or being called soft or emasculine. And that's been a big change for me in my life. Is, you know, I would say back in the day that I supported all that, but in practice I was like, oh, but, you know, you don't want to look weak, like, you have to, you know, all that. And certainly if you look at the people that I choose to highlight in this book, they have changed since some of my early writing. And, like, my notion of heroism now, I'll just give you an example. Like, you know, I don't know if he'll listen to this, and, like, me and my father have, like, a very strained relationship, and it's a shame, and we disagree about why that is and a million things, but we do disagree a lot about politics over the years. And, you know, I think, like, old Danny Okay, my dad was anti-war as a teenager, like straight up, like actively sort of opposed to the Vietnam War. Um, didn't want to like be in the like. I'm not saying he would have like run away from it, but like didn't want to be in the army. Didn't think it was right to like fight in that war. That it wasn't worth it. He followed the path of more sort of the classic Reagan Democrat to Republican transition that so many baby boomers did, right? And he then got more and more and more like politically conservative and like pro-war and stuff. Well, 5 years ago, when we would argue about our positions on war, whether I said it, which I think a few times I terribly did, or thought it most of the time, there was a part of me that was feeling and probably communicating to him. And I think this kind of answers the question in a very indirect but important way. Communicating to him, who are you to question my anti-war posture because I've been in 2 wars and you didn't want to be in them, or like you didn't. That is intellectually and ethically paltry, and it is satisfying in a like hit off the crack pipe sort of way. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like an initial. But most things in our lives that feel that way, they're not so great. You know what I mean? There's something missing. Now, at the time of writing Patriotic Dissent, my position on like, for example, and I talk about my father, I'm not talking about just him. I'm talking about like a generational argument, like a classic case of like the pro and anti-war folks talking to each other. And there is an intergenerational aspect. And I bet that there are probably a million people who have this exact sort of relationship with like their father, uncle, insert whatever here. Now my position is this. I'm proud of no matter what he thinks today, all right, and that's okay, and everyone's entitled to it. I am proud of my father's position as a 17-year-old because I, at 17, didn't feel that way about my wars of my generation. Like his instinct, his gut was right. And so rather than like, how toxic of me, right, to play the classic hero of you don't get an opinion because you didn't serve in the war, so how dare you question me? That's just intellectually just terrible. Logical fallacy. Now it's more like, okay, how can we have empathy? How can we reframe the entire concept of who gets an opinion, who has value, what platform matters, what makes you a man? And so now I say, and like, I want to almost say to him, like, and I haven't, we've been really not speaking much, but like, I want to say to him, like, Dad, like, and I want to say it to the whole people who went through his same development, Dad, like, I'm like super proud of that person. Like, I would have liked to have met that person. That doesn't mean that the person you are now is bad. It just means like, I'm sorry if I communicated that other way, because that is toxic. That's toxic masculinity, that's toxic militarism, and it's toxic patriotism. And this book is a rejection of that. And I'm not there. None of us are completely there. But I'm closer to saying the problem is the fact that we think having killed people or being in a position to want to or be willing to makes you not only tougher, better, but like more valuable, right, to society. And so the heroes I chose, even though many of them had been there, done that, and then had like a road to Damascus, they reject that. They reject the fetishization of that and the toxicity of that. So and that's a really strange answer maybe, but like I've never really talked about that before, and I think I'm on to something, or I hope. I don't know. Let the listeners decide.
Well, a while ago, you were on. You had an interview on Eyes Left. It wasn't specifically about your book, but some of the subjects got covered there, and I really enjoyed. I'm gonna butcher it here, so I'm just paraphrasing, but I really enjoyed your discussion with them about how that we as veterans, as people who went to war for America and came home, that we have a deep obligation to demystify the critiques of the military to such a degree that civilians, non-military folks like your dad can hold the same standing in an argument with a combat veteran because it's on the facts and it's not on the emotions. But I found that really powerful, and I know that I'm still making my way through that journey myself. still have some of the same hero ideas that I did when I was in. They've changed and morphed a lot, and definitely lean much more towards anti-war these days. But I think that that's a really important thing, and I'm really glad that you brought that up and that you discuss it at length in the book, that civilians' role in this is very powerful, and we need, as veterans, need to make it powerful for them. And I think that's what we do here on the podcast.
Yeah, I totally think, like we're a veterans progressive podcast. So like one could look at that and say like, you guys are selling based on the platform, right? Not selling like in a literal sense, but selling yourselves on the fact that you have this extra credibility. And I would say like guilty, like we live in the world as it is, and in the world as it is, we as a society has given veterans a platform. It has given us like a credibility with the public that we might not otherwise have. And so what I argued on Eyes Left, what I think I argue a little bit in the book is that is a responsibility. Like all applause, all laurels that are put upon you by a society are responsibilities, just like leadership. And most people don't look at it that way, but I think we really ought to. So if society, even if I don't agree that a veteran is just automatically better or more valuable in his opinions, or his opinions are more valuable, even if I don't agree with that, and I don't agree with that any longer, and I haven't for quite some time, but it was a slow process. Society has said that I do, or that we do, and I'm not gonna. So I have an obligation then. My obligation is to use it to those whom great things are given, right? Great responsibility. And then the second part is, as part of that platform, as part of that responsibility that has been kind of given to us by society, I think we have an obligation to say, no. Like, yes, I'm going to take it, but since you've given me this platform, I'm going to reject that. I'm going to reject the toxic sort of fetishizing of militarism that is inherent in that very sentiment that the veteran matters more. And so, in a sense, if we're doing our job, we make ourselves almost obsolete, right? And like, that's okay. That's okay. I want people to listen to what I have to say because I read books and I think a lot. And I'm not saying that experience doesn't play into it. I think it should. I just don't think that our veteran experience, which if you take sandpaper to it, it's very powerful to me to get to the root of all things. Like what is this for? Like look at anything. What is it for? If you scrub away the bullshit, the veneer, the pomp, right? What is there? Well, it's a willingness to kill and die, right? For an abstraction, almost always, right? It's never your home in American history, or even in most countries. It is rarely your home you're fighting for. So you fight for an abstraction, whether that be the state or the ideology of said state or the economic interest they are in. You're fighting for an abstraction, your willingness to kill and die. I'm just not sure. Well, I am sure. Front-loading that, prioritizing that, that the opinions of folks who were willing to do that, I don't know. I think that is very dangerous. And so, yeah, we have an obligation to sort of try to make that obsolete. And if it means we don't get invited to as many podcasts, well, then good. Because if it was easy and if it benefited us, then like it's probably not as profound an argument, right? If the argument you're making benefits you, even if that's not the reason you're making it, there's always going to be A, the suspicion that it is, and B, like it's just not as powerful, right? Because there's no sacrifice inherent. And there I go with like, obviously the Catholic martyrdom thing, but I think that it's valuable. And so, that's what I talk about in terms of, look, I'm going to tell you the stories of these military dissenters, but my point is that we need to rise above that. And like salvation's not going to come from your veterans.
No.
If we can be a catalyst, if we can be a, vanguard, to not go full-throated Bolshevism, but if we can be kind of like a vanguard, then that's great. But this needs to be like a society rising and rejecting the current formation of patriotism, not the military grabbing everyone's hand and white savior, which literally, given the demographics of the combat forces, would be the case. Like white savior military, sorry, that's not a good idea. That's not what should happen. White male savior at that.
Yeah. Well, Danny, I think that's a great place to wrap it up for today. I'm really excited for the book to come out. I'm hoping that listeners, I'm hoping you guys all go out and pick it up. It's going to be out on September 8th. Danny, can you tell the listeners where they can purchase your book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for doing this, by the way, Henry. It's interesting. I really thought through some stuff in the interview here that I hadn't before. But the book, look, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Target. You can get it on Walmart. Don't do that. Don't do that. Go to Heyday Books, right? Heyday. Heyday Books. Go to their website, Google it, type Patriotic Dissent. Book is there with all the reviews. There's a pre-order link, and then once it comes out, there's an order link. Support publishers and the book industry. That's the best place to find it. If you go to my website, the link of the picture of my book will take you right there. Okay, but you could also just Google it. So do that, and I'm always flattered if people want to read the book, and I appreciate it.
All right, that sounds good. Well, folks, thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back again soon. Take care. We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
And listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not detain